My beloved child. A quiet farewell often carries the loudest truth, and that is where this story begins. Not with raised voices. Not with dramatic promises. But with a silence so deep that every heartbeat seemed to echo inside it. Someone stood at the edge of a moment they believed they could control, only to realize that the heart has never obeyed pride. Before another word is spoken, remain here for a little longer, because something meaningful is slowly finding its way into the light, and when it does, you will understand why certain endings are never truly endings at all. There was a gathering that looked ordinary from the outside. Conversations drifted through the room. Gentle smiles appeared and disappeared. No one suspected that beneath those calm expressions, invisible emotions were colliding. Among those present was the one who had spent so much time trying to convince everyone including themselves that they had already moved on. They laughed when others laughed. They nodded when people spoke. Yet every glance carried an unspoken question they refused to ask aloud. Nearby stood the person you love, unaware that every quiet movement was being noticed. A simple smile. A thoughtful pause before answering someone. The kindness shown without expecting anything in return. These tiny moments reached places no argument ever could. Sometimes hearts are not changed by grand gestures. Sometimes they surrender because they witness a kind of peace they can no longer deny. What happened next was almost invisible. The third party slowly stepped back from the conversation. No one called attention to it. No one understood why their expression had changed. But inside, something long defended was beginning to crumble. They remembered every attempt to replace a connection that never truly belonged to them. They remembered every effort to silence feelings that kept returning when no one was watching. Strange, isn't it? People often believe love is won through persistence. Yet real affection has a quiet way of revealing where it has always belonged. It does not rush. It does not compete. It simply waits until every illusion becomes too heavy to carry. The room continued moving as though nothing unusual had happened. Someone poured another cup of coffee. Someone shared an ordinary story that made everyone smile. But hidden beneath those everyday moments was a conversation taking place inside a single heart, a conversation no one else could hear. I can't pretend anymore. Those words were never spoken aloud. They existed only within silent thoughts. And sometimes the words we never say shape our lives more than the ones we do. As the evening stretched forward, memories began arriving one after another. Tiny details returned without invitation. The way your kindness had remained consistent even when nobody noticed. The way your presence brought calm instead of confusion. The way genuine care cannot be copied, no matter how convincing an imitation appears. That realization did not arrive like lightning. It arrived like sunrise. Slowly. Patiently. Impossible to stop once it began. Have you ever wondered why certain people suddenly become quiet after talking so much? It is often because they have reached a truth that no longer needs defending. The louder the heart argued yesterday, the softer it becomes when honesty finally arrives. Without warning, the third party walked toward the exit. No dramatic scene followed. No one blocked the doorway. No one asked them to stay. Yet every step seemed heavier than the last, as though they were leaving behind far more than a room. They were walking away from a version of themselves that had survived on hope without certainty. Something important is waiting for you inside this moment, because what appeared to be a simple departure was becoming something entirely different. Just before reaching the door, they paused. Only for a heartbeat. Only long enough to look back one final time. Not with anger. Not with bitterness. But with an expression that surprised even them. Acceptance. The rare kind that arrives only after every excuse has disappeared. Across the room, the person you love felt something difficult to explain. It wasn't relief. It wasn't celebration. It was the quiet realization that certain chapters close without anyone forcing them shut. Life has a remarkable way of arranging moments that people could never organize on their own. Still, one question remained unanswered. Why had the third party stopped? Why hadn't they simply walked away? Even those closest to the moment sensed that unfinished words were hanging gently in the air. Sometimes silence prepares the heart for a sentence it could never receive if spoken too soon. Take a closer look at this picture unfolding before you. Every disappointment. Every misunderstanding. Every delayed answer. They were quietly leading toward this single turning point. Because truth often waits until every other possibility has exhausted itself. The third party slowly turned around. Their eyes no longer carried the determination that had once driven every decision. Instead, there was honesty, raw, peaceful, almost freeing. It was the kind of honesty people discover only after they stop trying to win what was never theirs to hold. No one interrupted. Even the room itself seemed to grow still. The next breath felt longer than the last. And just as everyone believed the moment had already passed, their lips began to move. Not loudly. Not dramatically. Simply enough for every waiting heart to hear. The words had not fully escaped yet. Only the beginning. Only the first fragile sound. Yet somehow everyone understood that once those final words were spoken, nothing inside that room would ever feel quite the same again. A single sentence can spend years hiding behind fear, only to appear when there is nothing left to protect. That was the strange beauty of the next moment. The room did not become louder, it became quieter, as though every ordinary sound had stepped aside to make space for something no one had expected to hear. Stay till the end, because what followed was not a dramatic confession. It was something far more powerful, a truth that had finally grown tired of hiding. The third party drew one slow breath. Their shoulders, once tense with determination, softened in a way that almost seemed unfamiliar. For the first time, they were no longer trying to convince anyone, not the people around them, not the person they had pursued, not even themselves. There is a peaceful kind of exhaustion that comes after pretending for too long, and that was exactly what rested in their eyes. Then, with remarkable calm, they spoke. "You're the one I love." The words were gentle. Almost fragile. Yet they carried a weight that seemed to ripple through every heart present. No one reacted immediately. Sometimes the deepest truths are met with silence because they leave no room for quick answers. Faces remained still. Eyes searched one another, wondering if they had truly heard what they thought they heard. It was not the confession itself that surprised everyone. It was the timing. Why now? Why after choosing to walk away? Why only when there seemed to be nothing left to gain? Questions filled the space where conversation usually lived. The person you love looked toward them, not with triumph or disbelief, but with quiet compassion. Genuine affection rarely celebrates another person's pain. Instead, it understands how difficult honesty can be when it arrives late. For a brief moment, the third party smiled. It was not the smile of someone expecting love in return. It was the smile of someone finally free from carrying a secret that had become heavier with every passing day. Perhaps this is one of life's quiet lessons. Not every confession is made to begin a relationship. Some confessions are spoken simply so the heart can finally breathe. The room slowly awakened again. A chair shifted gently across the floor. Someone looked toward the window instead of speaking. Another lowered their eyes, realizing they had witnessed something far more meaningful than they had first imagined. But inside the third party, another story was unfolding. Memories arrived one after another. The first conversation they had shared. The first laugh they had secretly replayed afterward. The first time they noticed themselves hoping for messages that never came. Tiny moments. Ordinary moments. Yet somehow they had quietly built an extraordinary attachment. How often do hearts fall in love without announcing it? Far more often than anyone realizes. Love does not always arrive with certainty. Sometimes it grows unnoticed until one ordinary day it quietly becomes impossible to ignore. The third party understood something they had resisted for months. Love cannot be borrowed. It cannot be negotiated. And it cannot be earned simply by refusing to let go. The person you love remained silent, offering no hurried response. That silence was not rejection. It was respect. Some words deserve time before they receive an answer. Isn't that how meaningful moments usually happen? They refuse to be rushed. Outside, the evening light had begun to soften. Golden reflections stretched across the windows as though the world itself had slowed its pace. Strange how nature often seems to mirror emotions we cannot explain. The third party took another step toward the doorway. This time, there was no hesitation. Only peace. Yet before crossing the threshold completely, they turned back once more, not because they wished to change anyone's mind, but because one final realization had found its way into their heart. I spent so much time trying to become the answer, they whispered softly, that I forgot love was never supposed to feel like a competition. No one interrupted. Because everyone knew those words belonged to more than one person. How many hearts had quietly lived that same story? How many people had mistaken persistence for connection? How many had overlooked the simple truth that what is genuine never needs to force its place? Something important is waiting for you, because the deepest part of this story has not yet revealed itself. The third party smiled one last time, not with regret, but with gratitude. Gratitude for finally understanding that even unanswered love can transform a person into someone wiser, kinder, and more honest than before. As the door slowly closed behind them, the room remained strangely still. But then, the person you love lowered their gaze towards something resting quietly on the nearby table. It was a small folded note. No one had noticed it before. No one knew who had placed it there. On the outside, written in careful handwriting, were only a few simple words. "Read this after I'm gone." And in that instant, everyone realized the confession had never been the final message. It had only been the beginning. Not every goodbye leaves behind an empty space. Sometimes it leaves behind a question so quiet, so deeply personal, that it continues speaking long after the footsteps have disappeared. The folded note rested on the table without asking for attention, yet somehow every glance returned to it. It seemed ordinary enough, just a small piece of paper, but there are moments when the smallest things carry the greatest weight. "Don't skip this part," because what seemed like a simple message was about to reveal a truth no one had been expecting. For several long seconds, no one reached for it. Perhaps everyone sensed that once those words were read, there would be no returning to the version of the story they thought they understood. Some truths wait patiently because they know the heart must be ready before it can receive them. Finally, the person you love stepped forward. Not quickly. Not nervously. Simply with the calmness of someone willing to face whatever honesty had been left behind. Their fingertips touched the folded paper with surprising gentleness. The edges were slightly worn, as though it had been carried for a long time before finding its proper place. That alone raised another quiet question. How many days? How many evenings? How many opportunities had come and gone before this letter was finally left behind? The room remained silent. Outside, the breeze brushed softly against the windows, almost like time itself had slowed to witness what would happen next. The note unfolded. Inside, there were no dramatic declarations. No endless explanations. Only carefully chosen words, each carrying the kind of sincerity that cannot be manufactured. If you're reading this, it means I finally found the courage to stop pretending. The person you love paused. Not because the sentence was difficult to understand. Because it felt painfully honest. There is something remarkable about honesty when it arrives without expectation. It no longer asks for applause. It no longer demands an answer. It simply tells the truth and allows it to exist. The next lines were even quieter. I thought holding on would prove my love. Instead, it only taught me that real love never grows by holding someone too tightly. Those words settled into every heart differently. One person remembered an old friendship they had tried too hard to keep alive. Another thought about a dream they had refused to release. Even the person you love found themselves reflecting on moments they had almost forgotten. Strange how one honest sentence can awaken memories that have been sleeping for years. The letter continued. You never promised me forever. That was a promise I secretly made to myself. And somewhere along the way, I confused my hope with reality. No accusation. No blame. Only understanding. Sometimes maturity arrives the moment we stop asking why life happened to us and begin asking what it came to teach us. A quiet breath escaped from the person you love. Not out of sadness. Out of respect. Because it takes remarkable strength to leave behind words that seek peace instead of sympathy. Across the room, someone quietly whispered, I never knew they carried all of this inside. But perhaps that is true of more people than we realize. How many smiles hide unfinished stories? How many cheerful conversations cover silent battles that no one else can see? You may never know. Yet kindness continues to matter precisely because of that. The letter was nearing its end. The handwriting became slightly softer, almost as though each word had been written after a long pause. Please don't remember me as someone who couldn't let go. Remember me as someone who finally learned that love also means wishing happiness for another person even when the journey continues without me. No one spoke. There was nothing to add. Nothing to correct. The silence itself became the response. The person you love carefully folded the note again, not to hide it, but to preserve it. Some words deserve to be carried, not because they keep us attached to the past, but because they remind us of who we are becoming. For a moment, it seemed the story had reached its natural conclusion. The confession had been spoken. The letter had been read. The goodbye had been accepted. And yet, life has an unexpected way of opening another door just when everyone believes the final page has been turned. As the folded note was placed back onto the table, something slipped quietly from between its pages. It wasn't another letter. It wasn't a photograph. It was a small pressed white flower, carefully preserved as though it had been protecting a memory for a very long time. Attached to it was a single handwritten line. I picked this on the first day I realized your heart already belonged somewhere else. The person you love stared at the delicate flower without moving. Because in that instant, they realized the third party had been carrying this quiet truth for far longer than anyone had ever imagined. And hidden beneath that tiny flower, there was one final folded page that no one had noticed before. The smallest discoveries rarely announce themselves. They wait quietly, almost patiently, until the exact moment a heart is ready to understand them. The second folded page rested beneath the delicate white flower, unnoticed until now, as though it had been hidden by intention rather than accident. The room remained still. Even those who believed the story had already reached its ending could feel that another layer was waiting beneath the surface. Stay till the end, because sometimes the final page of one person's story becomes the first page of someone else's healing. The person you love lifted the second note with careful hands. Unlike the first, this page was untouched by creases. It had been folded only once, protected as though it contained something too precious to be exposed too soon. A slow breath filled the silence. Then the words appeared. If you have come this far, thank you for giving my truth a place to rest. There was something different about this message. It no longer sounded like someone holding on to disappointment. It sounded like someone who had finally discovered peace. The handwriting carried a calm rhythm, each sentence flowing without hesitation. I used to believe that if I loved deeply enough, life would eventually choose me. But love is not a reward waiting at the finish line. It is a gift that must remain free. No one moved. Those words seemed to settle into every corner of the room, gentle enough not to disturb anyone, yet strong enough to change the atmosphere completely. The person you love continued reading. I watched you smile when you thought no one was looking. I watched you encourage others when your own heart was uncertain. Those moments taught me something I could never learn by chasing you. They taught me the difference between admiration and possession. A quiet realization passed across every face. How often do people mistake wanting someone for truly understanding them? Real affection notices the quiet things. The kindness offered without recognition. The patience shown without applause. The hope carried without expectation. Those are the moments that quietly reveal who someone really is. The evening light had become softer now, painting long golden reflections across the room. Everything felt slower, as though time itself had chosen not to interrupt. The letter continued. There was one evening when I almost told you everything. You smiled at me, asked if I was doing well, and before I could answer, you helped someone else who needed you more. That was the moment I realized your heart naturally moved toward kindness. I couldn't ask you to become someone different simply to make my story easier. The person you love closed their eyes for a brief second. They remembered that evening. At the time, it had seemed completely ordinary. Yet someone else had quietly carried that memory ever since. Isn't that remarkable? The moments we barely remember often become unforgettable chapters in someone else's life. The page grew lighter, almost hopeful. If you ever think of me, don't think about the tears. Think about the gratitude. Because knowing someone like you reminded me that genuine people still exist. A faint smile appeared. Not because the words erased every sadness, but because they transformed it into something meaningful. Sometimes healing begins the moment we stop asking why something ended and begin appreciating that it happened at all. The final paragraphs seemed almost unexpected. They say people enter our lives for many reasons. Some stay. Some leave. Some quietly prepare our hearts for the love that was always meant to find us. I believe my role was never to change your path. It was simply to become a better person because our paths crossed. Silence answered once again. No one felt the need to fill it. The message had already spoken more deeply than conversation ever could. The person you love carefully folded the page and placed it beside the white flower. For a few peaceful moments, everything seemed complete. The confession. The farewell. The gratitude. The understanding. Yet something unusual caught their attention. On the back of the final page, almost hidden near the bottom corner, was a tiny handwritten sentence that none of them had noticed before. It wasn't addressed to the room. It wasn't even addressed to the person you love. It was addressed to someone whose name had never been mentioned throughout the entire evening. And beneath that name were only 8 quiet words. Please tell them. I finally understand what love truly means. The room fell silent once more. Because suddenly everyone realized the third party's final journey had never been about winning someone's heart. It had been about transforming their own. And no one yet knew who that mysterious name belonged to, or why revealing it would change everything in the next chapter. Some names remain hidden for a reason. They wait in the background until every emotion has settled, until every assumption has gently faded away. The tiny sentence at the bottom of the page seemed almost impossible to ignore now. It wasn't written larger than the rest. It wasn't decorated or emphasized. Yet somehow it became the only thing anyone could think about. Something important is waiting for you. Because the meaning of that name was never about creating another mystery, it was about revealing the quiet purpose behind everything that had happened. The person you love turned the page over once more, studying the graceful handwriting. The mysterious name felt familiar, but not in the way anyone expected. It was not the name of a rival. It was not someone from the past who had caused pain. It belonged to an elderly family friend, someone who had quietly encouraged people without ever asking for recognition. A gentle realization settled across the room. Months earlier, that wise friend had once shared a simple thought with the third party. If love teaches you only how to receive, you have learned very little. But if love teaches you how to become kinder, then no matter how the story ends, your heart has already won. At the time, those words had seemed impossible to accept. Now they carried an entirely different meaning. The third party had remembered them. They had carried them through every uncertain day. And finally, they had understood. The person you love smiled softly, not because everything suddenly made perfect sense, but because they could now see the journey through different eyes. So much of what had appeared to be conflict had actually been quiet growth. So much of what had looked like loss had gently become wisdom. Perhaps this is why life often keeps its deepest lessons hidden until we are ready to recognize them. The room slowly came back to life. Someone poured another cup of tea. A window was open just enough for the cool evening breeze to enter. The ordinary world returned, yet nothing felt ordinary anymore. One family member finally spoke. "I always thought they were trying to change someone else's heart." Another answered with a thoughtful smile. "No, they were learning how to change their own." Those simple words lingered. Sometimes the greatest transformation happens so quietly that no one notices until the journey is already complete. The person you love carefully placed both letters back inside their envelope, along with the pressed white flower. They didn't want those memories scattered. They wanted them preserved exactly as they had been left. As they held the envelope, another memory quietly surfaced. There had been one conversation many months ago. The third party had asked an unusual question. "If someone truly belongs in your future, how do you know?" At the time, the answer had been simple. You stop feeling like you have to convince them to stay. Those words had seemed ordinary back then. Tonight they returned with unexpected clarity. The third party had never forgotten them. Perhaps that single conversation had been the first step toward the peace they eventually found. Outside, the evening sky had begun to fill with gentle stars. One by one they appeared, not all at once, but patiently. Healing often arrives the same way. Not in one dramatic moment, but through quiet realizations that slowly replace old fears with new understanding. The person you love walked toward the doorway where the third party had stood only a short while earlier. There were no footprints. No sign they had ever paused there. Only the memory of their final words remained. "You're the one I love." For the first time, those words no longer sounded like a plea. They sounded like gratitude. Like someone thanking another person for unknowingly helping them discover who they were becoming. A peaceful smile crossed the face of the person you love. "I hope they find the happiness they were always searching for," they whispered. No one answered. No answer was needed. Sometimes the kindest wishes are the ones spoken without expecting to be heard. Just as everyone believed the evening had finally reached its quiet conclusion, a soft knock echoed from the front door. Only once. Gentle. Unhurried. Everyone exchanged curious glances. No one had been expecting another visitor. The person you love opened the door. Standing there was the elderly family friend whose name had appeared at the bottom of the letter. They smiled warmly, holding a small wooden box wrapped in faded blue ribbon. "I believe," they said with calm certainty, "this was meant to be opened tonight." The room grew silent once again. Because no one, not even the person you love, had ever seen that wooden box before. And whatever rested inside had been waiting patiently for this exact moment.